Hello, goblins and ghouls, and happy October. I'm signing on just before Halloween, and I kept my reading for the Rory Gilmore reading list this month extra spooky. So we're coming in on brand with our big witchy hair and wishing everyone a happy spooky season. So I kept my book list a little bit short this month, partially because my September reading kind of bled into October a little bit, and partially because I was realizing my summary videos were getting a little bit long. So we're going to experiment with discussing just 5 books today and see if that feels like a better length. So I read 3 books on the Rory Gilmore reading list this month and threw in 2 bonus ones. 4 out of 5 were spooky. One of the bonus books I had to do for work, so I couldn't really control the content too much, but we'll discuss that one last. So yeah, let's dive into talking about some fun ghost stories. The first book that I read this month, well, actually, I'm going to discuss things out of order a little bit. So I started with Beloved by Toni Morisson this month, and that is a book that I'd read before and had been really amazed with on my past readings and enjoyed it again this time around. I actually, don't really think of Beloved as a horror story. But as I was reading it at the beginning of October and kind of started thinking, oh, it could be fun to do a spooky theme for my video, I, of course, started um, really leaning into the ghost story aspect of Beloved. And even if it's not often or always classified as a horror story, it certainly has a lot of those elements. So it fit right in. I'm going to come back to discussing it because I wanted to start mostly with my second book and kind of do some tie-ins from there. So the second book that I read this month was Carrie by Stephen King. And this is actually my first Stephen King novel ever and Stephen King's first novel ever. So Carrie was Stephen King's first novel. Prior to that, he was writing short stories. And this novel was published in the 70s, so recently celebrated its 50th anniversary. And I actually listened to the audiobook, and it was like a re-release new edition that they had done in celebration of the 50th anniversary. And one of the things that they included for this special version of the audiobook was a foreword by Margaret Atwood. And I just looked it up. It looks like it was actually also published as an essay with the New York Times. And I mention that because I really recommend anyone read it if they're interested in Stephen King, if they're interested in the genre of horror. Margaret Atwood, of course, is incredible in her own right and provides, it's a pretty meaty forward. So she provides a pretty robust summary of the book and then also offers a lot of really interesting literary analysis and discussion of not only the book's staying power, but also some of Stephen King's genius, really. And another thing that she does in the foreword is celebrate and kind of dig into the genre of horror. And I really appreciated that because I'm not a huge horror reader. I have enjoyed the horror books that I read, but it's not a genre that I gravitate to in books or honestly really in movies either. I used to watch a lot more horror when I was younger. And I mean, maybe this is true of everyone for horror, but I never really enjoyed it. I feel like maybe that's not the right word to describe the experience of a truly terrifying horror movie or book. So I guess maybe I'm not alone in saying that I never really enjoyed it. But I think when I was young, I had a couple friends who were into horror films, so we watched a lot of them. And then as I spent less time with those friends, I kind of slipped away from horror films. So anyway, I'm not a huge horror girl. Although um, I love ghost stories, zombie stories, vampire stories, anything like that. But I think it's the aspect I love, kind of the symbolism and the depth of those kinds of characters and those kinds of stories. What I don't love as much is like the scary part. So I think that's part of why Margaret Atwood's notes on horror were really interesting for me. And I think I'm just going to go ahead and read a couple, 2 paragraphs from her forward. And this is specifically discussing Carrie, but has some fruitful cross-pollination opportunities, I think, for any great horror story. So Margaret Atwood writes, King is a visceral writer and a master of granular detail. As Marianne Moore said, the literary ideal is imaginary gardens with real toads in them. And boy, there are a lot of toads in King's work. He writes horror, the most literary of forms, especially when it comes to the supernatural, which must perforce be inspired by already existing tales and books. All the quasi-scientific hocus pocus about the genetic inheritability of telekinesis is just a cover-up. But underneath the horror, in King, is always the real horror, the all too actual poverty and neglect and hunger and abuse that exists in America today. And here she's quoting King. I went to school with kids who wore the same neck dirt for months, kids whose skin festered with sores and rashes, kids with the eerie, dried apple doll faces that result from untreated burns, kids who were sent to school with stones in their dinner buckets and nothing but air in their thermoses. The ultimate horror for him, as it was for Dickens, is human cruelty, and especially cruelty to children. It is this that distorts charity, the better side of our nature, the side that prompts us to take care of others. I think this is part of King's widespread appeal. Yes, he shows us the weird stuff, but in the context of the actual. So I'll stop there, but again, I definitely recommend this essay. So I think that, of course, Margaret Atwood said it better than I ever could. Part of the allure of horror as a genre and incredibly well done pieces of horror like Carrie are that they use extreme, or I think she called it weird, the weird stuff. In the case of Carrie, it's her telekinetic powers and the way she uses them for really wide-scale destruction after she just faces one too many cruelties at the hands of her peers. So it's, and this is true of a lot of horror, and this is kind of where I wanted to connect it to Beloved. In the case of Beloved, the weird stuff is a ghost. Setha, the main character, is haunted by the ghost of her child, who she killed after escaping from her enslavers in order to prevent the enslavers from taking her child back into slavery. And so she's, her house is kind of haunted by the spirit of this child, and then eventually the spirit of the child returns in an embodied form and sort of takes over Setha's life. So both cases, very different authors, very different themes, but they use the weird stuff, the horror, to kind of get at, as Margaret Atwood puts it, the all too actual poverty and abuse that exist in the world. And that is, I think, the strength of really powerful horror stories. And so yes, as you might guess, my takeaway for writers from for this month, really, honestly, is experimentation with the horror genre. And specifically, I think I'm going to be thinking a lot more about Margaret Atwood's claim that horror is the most literary of forms. And in the passage that I read, the reason that she was making that claim is because horror is very referential, in the sense that as a genre kind of builds on, as she puts it, already existing tales and books of the supernatural. And it's a little bit more kind of mythological, or I was going to say collaborative, but that might be too far of a stretch than some other genres. But that's what she means by literary, that horror like references other books and other works and other cultural artifacts in a way that some other fiction genres don't. But I think that the claim that horror is the most literary can also be extended past that, in the sense that I think horror is often much more allegorical and much more symbolic than a lot of other genres. So I think that's my takeaway as a writer for this month, and hopefully something that you all can play with too. Just the idea of kind of embodying all too actual problems that you want to discuss in your work and embodying them in the weird stuff like ghosts and, traumatized telekinetic teens and, whatever, zombies, vampires, whatever the horror, your flavor of horror might be. And, kind of finding the voice to discuss the depth of those issues, and also I think the cathartic way to discuss those issues by embodying problems like cruelty, slavery, abuse, hunger as a monster that can be, contended with and confronted with and depicted in a really like literal way. So that's the takeaway and strong plug for really all of all of these writers. I feel like I could have a lot more to say about Beloved in a different context. That is, of course, one of the great kind of modern American classics. Toni Morisson is a true national treasure, and Beloved definitely gets 5 stars from me. So there's a lot more that I could say about that, and I'm sure I will in the future. I'm planning some kind of 5-star roundup videos, so I'll discuss more about it then. But for now, I think suffice to say that Beloved is one of the most visceral books that I have ever read, in its weird stuff horror qualities and also in its celebration of the beauty in the world, and the potential for beauty in the world. And it's just one of those books that really contrasts utter despair, utterly unbearable cruelty with like just absolutely poetic appreciation for the beauty of the natural world and the beauty of being a free person, able to wake up and make their own choices. And I think there's a moment where Setha wakes up and realizes that she's in control of her own time, and what amazes her is just being able to look at the leaves on the tree outside her window. So yeah, Toni Morisson is a poet, absolutely a real master. So strong plug for that. And we'll move on. Yes, Edgar Allan Poe was my third and final choice for the month of October from the Rory list. So this was the collected works of Poe. And it was a really interesting and kind of trippy experience for me, because I think probably like most of you, I was familiar with his, I guess, more famous or more popular stories, and poems. So, of course, The Raven, The Fall of the House of Usher, Cask of Amontillado, Telltale Heart, Mask of the Red Death. I had read all of those, I think, in school mostly. And this book was organized by, sorry, so hard to do that with the camera. This book was organized by collections that were published. So he published his stories mostly in periodicals, and then starting in like the 1840s, they published a couple like collections. So this was divided according to that, and all of those stories that I just named were published in his collection called Tales of Horror and Suspense. So I was pretty familiar with those. It was fun to revisit them. But it was also really fun to discover some new Poe stories, which were mostly under this collection called Tales of the Grotesque and Arabesque, which is such a Poe-esque title. I'm actually going to do another little bonus video that I'll post on my channel right after this. I'm going to read one of those stories because Poe just really bears being read aloud. I was saying that Toni Morisson is a poet. Poe is also a poet. He just, I don't know how to even describe his language. He just like dives in to the pool of language and just swims around. Like, his sentences are so long. You have to unpack them phrase by phrase. He uses all kinds of really imaginative, sometimes made up, sort of Shakespearean type language. And then once you kind of get through the language, is the depictions of these really wild, imaginative, surreal scenes. So I think surreal is a really good way to describe the reading experience for Poe. And I feel like he needs to be read aloud. So I'm going to go ahead and read one aloud for you if anyone is interested in just hitting play. And I feel like even if you have it on in the background and you don't even listen to the story as a story, just listen to the words. It's wild and very Halloweeny. It's a good time. So I think my takeaway for writers from Poe is like just not to be shy or afraid about letting language be sticky and just getting your fingers in it and making a mess. I think when we're writing, it's so easy to be self-critical, and it's so easy to get focused on what we're trying to say rather than how. And I think Poe is such a great example of also form matching function because he tells stories in a really wild way and his stories are really wild. But I think it doesn't, he's an extreme example. It's unlikely that anyone listening to this will write the way that Poe writes, but I think he kind of gives us permission or shows us what it could be like to just, like I said, make a mess. And it's not that his writing is incoherent or messy in that way. It's just that it's it's extra. There's a lot of, to quote one of my favorite Lewis Carroll lines, there's a lot of muchness in Poe. So yeah, I would say, when you're eating your extra trick or treat candy get into November, maybe try a little Poe-esque muchness in your writing, and I think it'll be really fun and freeing. So on to my bonus books. The first bonus book and my final spooky, I don't even know if I can call this book spooky, for this month is Blood Orange. So I went to my local bookstore and I was like, hey, what's up for October? Like looking for something fun. And this woman recommended this book to me and she was like, it's a Dracula retelling. And I thought, perfect, that's perfect for this month, right up my alley. Love Dracula, love the Victorian era, like send it. But I had my Audible credit, so I decided to listen to it. And I felt so blindsided because it is a Dracula retelling. So Dracula is one of the main characters. But primarily, it is a romance, and it is the spiciest, sexiest book that I have ever read, and was completely fatiguing, like ears bleeding, fatiguing to listen to on audio because I don't even think I'm exaggerating to say there would be a whole chapter, perhaps even leaking into the next chapter. Ooh, leak is a weird word in this context. Leaking into the next chapter of just sex scenes, like so much sex. And I, love a spicy book as much as the next girl. I think I've said that on here many times before. Have nothing wrong with the sex scenes, enjoy them, in fact. But it was just like one after another, and I felt like we needed something more to connect them. And it also just kind of pulled me out of the enjoyment of, because I feel like so much of sex in general, but especially sex in art, like so much of us being able to enjoy it is like the tension and the build up. And this book missed the build up and the tension mark for me. There just wasn't a whole lot of build up, and then there was no tension because they just like never stopped doing it once they started. But the vampire stuff in the novel is cool. I feel like they took kind of some unique twists, added in a little bit of like well, there's vampires and witches, so that's fun. A little bit of witchy business too. And then they added in kind of a reincarnation type element as well. So vampires aren't the only kind of like immortal souls in the world, it seems like. And the end of the book very strongly sets up for the sequel, which is out as well. which is called, oh geez, I forgot. Hang on. Blood Orange. Sorry, y'all. Black Rose. Black Rose is the sequel. I can't remember if I mentioned the author. Geez, I'm kind of blowing this one. Karina Halle is the author. So anyway, it was fun. Just maybe if you go in warned, which I was not, about the level of sex in this book, you'll be prepared. There's also it's like advanced level sex, definitely some like bondage and that kind of stuff as well. So heads up. But I would say don't listen to this book. Read it. That would be my advice. But yeah, that was a fun, spooky-ish, vampire-ish October read, and I don't have any takeaways except, well, I guess my takeaway for writers is build tension in any situation, but especially if you're trying to include sex in your book, there has to be tension. There has to be, kind of build up in order to make it feel satisfying and earned for the reader. So that's my takeaway there. And then the final book for my October Spooktacular video is not a spooky book. This is another historical fiction book. You're realizing my brand here. This is Lisa Wingate's Shelterwood. So as I mentioned, I read this one for work. I wrote a study guide on this book, and I really enjoyed it. So she also wrote Before We Were Yours. So she is a pretty beloved historical fiction novelist. And this one used the dual timeline trope that is common in a lot of historical fiction and that I've discussed already on this channel as well. What I really appreciated about this book was it was kind of a corner of the world, a corner of the country that I don't know much about. It was set in southeast Oklahoma, and it also depicted a time period that I don't know a whole lot about either, which is kind of the early 1900s. So yeah, it was really interesting. She's a very powerful storyteller, so it was a fun read. Definitely one of the better historical fiction books that I've read in the past couple months. And yeah, that's that. So I'm going to sign off. We're going to work on keeping this video a little short, and we'll see that might be a little bit more palatable for all y'all who are out there listening to me yap. And I wish you all a spooky, safe, and spooky Halloween, and eat a Reese's pumpkin for me. That's my personal favorite. And I will be signing back on in November for my next month's selection. All right. Ciao, ciao.